Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Hey, peace to everyone in the chat. Please like the video when coming in.
Yes. So today's topic is Black liberation and socialism and its history. Just a high-level covering of the history of Black liberation struggle and as well as socialism as an ideology within the community itself. And so, Renaissance, what has been your understanding of Black socialism or socialism in the Black community?
From my understanding, it's played various roles throughout history. You had various factions who sought to liberate Black people through various means. Obviously, your Black capitalist had the traditional view of the Black community and how to use uplift to empower the community. Someone like more of a Marcus Garvey or a Booker T. Washington, those two people come to mind initially when you look at historical Black figures. When I think socialism, I think more of a Du Bois and his philosophy for uplift, as well as Dr. King towards the end of his life. He died a democratic socialist as well. So very much having a critique of the capitalist economic system and what he thought, I guess, led to the plight of Black people.
Yeah, and I think for me, kind of expounding on what you've already covered, is that liberalism and socialism are two different things. Liberalism supports the idea of capitalism, while socialism focuses on the deconstructing of capitalism from a worker standpoint, from a labor standpoint. And so I think sometimes people kind of conflate the two. You kind of see that come from the right a lot, but there is some measure of difference there, if not significant difference between the two. And so for me, I think in the Black community, I think what happens here is everybody just creates this one bucket for the left, for leftist ideals, and they just drop liberalism and socialism and communism and capitalism, capitalism and other sort of isms into one bucket, and then you kind of just carry that weight. And I think that's a misnomer for a lot of people, that for Black people, especially Black men coming out of slavery, and in slavery, the slave revolts were based on class struggle. And because of the class struggle, it created a need or a necessity to actually overthrow the economic system and the political system for what it is and turn it on top of its head so that it create something new that reflects the best interests of the proletariat class, which thus became the Black community as we know it today. And so a lot of people kind of throw these ideas around, but don't really understand that there's significant difference between the two.
Yeah. I would add also two names while you were talking that popped in my head were the Black Panthers. Their policies of things like free health clinics, free breakfast program for kids, which is still in existence today. For those people who don't know, when you start talking about people who are on reduced lunch or free lunch in public schools, that program started with the Panthers. Another individual who comes to mind as well is Paul Robeson. He was very outspoken. His activism traveled to the USSR. He's another one that comes to mind.
Yeah, and so A. Philip Randolph is probably the most prolific figure within the socialist movement within the Black community in the 20th century. And then, I've lamented about him in the onslaught of the introduction live stream that we did, that I did, at the beginning of this channel. And what A. Philip Randolph did was so instrumental for Black people, especially Black men, being that figurehead to actually take on the take on the movement against capitalist systems within the country itself in a Jim Crow era. Think about that, right? A Jim Crow era where racial segregation in the South and racism in the North and just organizing labor, right? That allowed people to negotiate wages better. Black people to negotiate wages better for what they were doing at the time, which is the porters of the sleepy car railroad. And so these sort of ideas led up to meeting with FDR and then, getting stake, for Black people inside the military industrial complex of what they call munitions, the production of munitions and things of that nature. Also, you think about Henry Ford and his production line of vehicles and stuff like that. That sort of labor that was able to get in and actually create a living wage for themselves, and they were getting paid $5 a day. Back then that was really huge, right? Where everybody else is probably making like $1.50 a day. Like, that was significant. You're talking middle class wages. And so that sort of class struggle and thought process, that mentality to actually push back against the capitalist system is actually something that has been inside the Black community probably 100 years before even A. Philip Randolph even got there, right? You're talking the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. A. Philip Randolph didn't come until, post World War I. And so class struggle has been the core center of, socialist movement within the community itself.
Yeah. One thing that I think comes to mind too is when you look at sort of collective economics as well. I was reading about basically some of the historically the ideas that have existed within the Black community, and then I guess a return to that. The economist's name, she slips my mind right now, but she essentially advocated for like mutual aid societies, community co-ops, community ownership of resources and distribution of resources. Just historically how that's worked and how we've gotten away from that as a community, and a return to that would be a tool for empowerment, collective ownership, whether you go to the extreme of, one vote, one worker, one vote, or sort of a hybrid model of that. If you're looking at, say, a company or a structure, or if you're just talking more of a just community-based type of economic system that's more focused on the needs of the community, making sure that you don't do or engage in any policies that may hurt or harm the community. While profit motive does exist, it's not something you would put over the overall community well-being.
Yeah, and it reflects the it reflects the idea of the people itself, right? And so, although people argue about Obamacare today, universal healthcare was a discussion in the 20s and 30s. In fact, in Germany, they already had universal healthcare coverage, in 1885 or 1890 or something like that. And so, for Black people, universal healthcare has been a struggle since the 30s, right? Since the New Deal. And so, the reason why you didn't get it before was because of racist backlash, right? This sort of idea that Black people are not or should not be equally represented under these sort of systems, because you had racist doctors who were saying, hey, I'm not going to be working on these Black people. Why should I work on these Black people? From a healthcare standpoint. So the need, for socialist systems in place, universal healthcare was always a talking point within the community itself. in mutual aid, like you mentioned before, also another component of that system. And public education, the integration of the schooling and things of that nature. Not that these are super radical, but at the time they were radical ideas. And so public housing, the FHA, these are sort of democratic institutions that were trying to be built by Black people of the Roaring 20s, late 30s, mid 30s, up into the 40s and well into the 50s. It precipitated well into the 60s, and that's how long it took for that struggle. And I think a lot of people misunderstand and misquote what they interpret socialism to be. They think that it's some cultural ideal, and it's beyond culture. It's actually looking out for the best interests of the people. And there's various forms of socialism, but for Black people in this context is that Black people were underrepresented and underserved in these areas, and it was very important to actually strive for these sort of democratic institutions to be put in place.
Essentially, what I think of when I think of socialism, I shared with you a podcast that Planet Money did on socialism. They described it essentially as when you look at socialism with what we're thinking of, whereas you're still in a capitalistic society, but essentially you acknowledge that capitalism is going to produce inequality, and in order for that inequality to not become so distorted and so vast, you're going to have natural mechanisms that redistribute wealth and basically ensure that you do not have an elite group of people who are able to essentially determine everything in the society, even to the detriment of the majority of people. Basically, you don't have an oligarchy. Small group of people who just make all these decisions that's going to naturally occur from a capitalism.
But in reality, that's what happened, which is how the New Deal came about from FDR. You got minimum wage out of the New Deal. You got Social Security out of the New Deal. Something that should have greatly benefited Black people, but Black people were kind of X'd out of that. But it doesn't negate the design of the institution and the component itself. And so the oligarchy ended up having to cough up a huge tax. I forget what they taxed them at. Probably something like 65% or whatever it was. You didn't get all of these sort of great functions within American society without it. And I think Black people's struggle is tied in, with the inequalities of capitalism, right? And so in slavery, you had, the exploitation of labor from Black men and Black women, but more importantly, Black men in this aspect, because they were the main laborers, right? They were the ones doing a lot of the heavy lifting and the shuffling and the things of that nature. And I think people misunderstand that capitalism isn't just about exchanging goods from one person to the next. It was a top-down system where Black people could not partake in it. And to this very day, that still happens, right? So that's why you have antitrust legislation that came out of the Sherman Act, right? Black people were not even allowed in certain unions, to do banking in certain banking institutions. They weren't allowed to have these sort of credit unions and things that we know of today. They didn't have all of that back then. So a lot of their wealth was, siphoned out of the community, so to speak. We know that Black people put their money into a savings and loan bank, only for that savings and loan bank to be robbed, and that precipitated the FDIC. And so these sort of components, institutional components, had to come in place in order to offset the system of inequality. And so socialism had a dirty name from a cultural standpoint because of the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1920s, and what was then now known as the USSR. The proletariats overtook the government in a hostile fashion and basically try to manage it themselves. And you can argue about the positive and negative of it, but something had to be done for them. But for us, revolution came out of slavery, which then precipitated black men in the South running for office, taking office in the South, and having the Union soldiers back them, and become the security guarantor of their democracy in the South. And that was short lived, but it was the possibility of class struggle, being the precipitator of it. So.
Yes, essentially with capitalism, essentially black people have been relegated to basically being workers because of denial of access to capital, because of theft of when people did have assets that could give them the ability to be in a ownership position. We've essentially occupied a role that basically makes us very vulnerable in a capitalistic system. Going back to the podcast I mentioned earlier, Richard Wolff essentially talked about when you look at a capitalistic system, essentially what ends up happening is it's very unstable. You tend to have recessions or bust in the cycle every 5 to 6 years. And essentially what happens with those busts is there's a certain elements of your society that essentially get thrown out of the workforce, and they essentially have to wait for the economy to recover to come back into the workforce. And that's how they end up losing ground, as they're continually being thrown out of the workforce. And he highlighted 3 groups specifically. He highlighted immigrants, women, but most notably African Americans. And we have the saying in our community that when white people get a cold, black people catch the flu. And that's essentially what that's alluding to, is when you have these downturns in this capitalistic system, essentially what happens is black people bear the brunt of that. Look no further than COVID. Look at how many black businesses were destroyed. I believe as high as upwards of 40% ended up folding. When you look at the unemployment rate for black people, and it's still a work in progress as we begin to come out and the economy begins to recover and form some sense of normalcy. Our community is lagging essentially behind that, and that's a byproduct of the system. So what a more socialistic view of the economy would do is you'd be looking at policies that would target those groups that bear that brunt. So specific policies, whether it be, you've seen some of it with extended unemployment and things along those lines, but whether it be changing the structure of your business. So, for example, instead of people getting laid off, maybe people across the board take a pay cut. Maybe you can vote on that, or people can get reassigned, reorganized. So when you start talking about socialism, you're talking about some of those reforms, a safety net, things like UBI, universal basic income, essentially to subsidize that gap and inequality that's being created by the system.
Yeah, I mean, maldistribution of resources, also the exploitation. Again, a lot of people don't understand that the prison industrial complex is radically tied in with the capitalist system of inequality. That black people throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, in the early to mid 2000s, they were they were the ones to be exploited. They were the demographic to be exploited for a capitalist venture, which was to build more prisons, private prisons, and so on and so forth, more policing, 1033 programs like MRAPs and other sort of militaristic, components that was added to the police department, and overtime. There are a lot of police officers who were milking the system in these predominantly black areas, as well as nickel and diming those same poor black people, like we saw in Ferguson, to fund their capitalist venture. So capitalism wasn't just a private enterprise thing, it was a public enterprise venture as well, because your law enforcement is public, is a public-based system as well, right? It's a public institution. And so this sort of thing went on beyond the private sector. We're well into the public sector. A lot of people made a lot of money off of the backs of black men and women going to jail heavily. A lot of construction and things of that nature. And so that only further the desire to turn the system on top of its head. Now, I think a lot of people today are misguided in their ideas of what they want from an anti-capitalist standpoint. And I'm not saying anybody should. I'm saying that this is the conversation that is being had. People don't know what to replace the system with. You can't replace capitalism with capitalism. It doesn't work, right, for black people. And so there's no way for them to catch up. So how do you, for them, I'm speaking for these people, what do they envision being the alternative, right? Socialism has been tainted by the media and by white constituents, especially on the right, as being something that's bad, and we don't really need that. But in reality, black people do need it, because institutions like the U.S. Postal Service, which has a probably 35-40% employment rate for black people, created a living wage for black people. And it had unionization as well as pensions. These are very strong. This was an example of a very strong institution that that actually aided in black people's upward mobility from a worker standpoint, right? So you didn't have to go to college to work for the USPS, the United States Postal Service. You had the ability to come straight from high school, from a GED, get a job in this sector, make a decent living, come out of it with a union backing, come out of it with a pension, and in the end, and actually be able to afford to buy a house and take care of one or two kids and a wife and a dog. That was actually the American dream in black people's grasp. But then we started seeing the defunding of the United States Postal Service. We started seeing defunding of different sort of institutions that black people were heavily involved in, like teaching, right? Let's defund public schools, but they didn't want to defund the police department, right? So what I'm saying is the areas where black people are mostly dominant is in the public sector. So the desire to increase public sector employment for black people, where there was unionization, where there was a living wage, where there was actually fair representation, is something that can't be lost. I think that we're people who want to go against this and say we shouldn't rely on the government. How can you say something like that with all the history that precedes it?
Yeah, and I'll give you another institution, the military. That's been a very major institution for facilitating black upward mobility. When you look at specifically even the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank, they did a study on black men and upward mobility, and military service was one of the characteristics that drove upward mobility.
Governor Cuomo's in.
You're essentially looking at the ability for someone to go in out of high school with no training and basically have opportunities to go to college, go to grad school, have that paid for, get other additional skills that they can use either in the civilian world or turn it into a full career, do it for 20, 25 years, and then come out and find a job in the private sector. And when you look at the pay structure in the military, that's where it's really reflected, in the sense of you have people basically paid by rank versus occupation. So that's just another example. Obviously, the workers' programs of the 1930s that were implemented to get the, I believe it's the Workers' Progress Association.
WPA.
Yeah, WPA. Yeah. That essentially went and basically rebuilt the infrastructure of America during that time period as a means to get the economy moving and provide a boost to Black America as well, as far as getting us out of the recession. And when you look at things like the military, like I mentioned before, when you look at the contractors, that was one of the first industries that was desegregated through executive order, was military contracting as well. So whether it be people being able to go into that industry when World War II was going on and basically provide a living wage, middle class income that wasn't available, or just having the ability to go into the military itself, those institutions and the stakeholders around it have just been, like I said, great opportunities for upper mobility.
Yeah. I mean, and now we look at modern day, we think about the digital divide. I think they found out during COVID, something like maybe 1/3 of Black students, close to over 1/3, did not have proper internet access to work remotely, to enroll in school remotely. That's absurd in a first world country. So you see this sort of impact of inequality from a capitalist standpoint, that Black people did not have high-speed internet, nor did they have a functioning laptop device, computing device, which would have been a laptop or a desktop. They did not have a functioning device. And so you're telling these people to, well, we can just do remote learning. How? They don't even have a computer that has Windows 10 at home. Some of these kids still have Windows 7, old Macintosh that were barely working, iPads with cracked screens, sharing internet services because they could not afford Comcast or Verizon for that matter. And so, which brings me to my next point. You have Governor Cuomo, and this happened this week. New York law requires $15 a month high-speed internet access for low-income households. This is a law that was just passed in New York just a few days ago. And that sort of, the digital divide is a byproduct of the inequalities of capitalism. And so from a socialist standpoint, a lot of people will say, well, what's the socialist response to that? Well, why don't we treat internet, high-speed internet, as a public utility, and we fund it with our tax dollars, and therefore we're not beholden to these private capitalist firms like Comcast and Verizon and RCN and Time Warner and these other blood-sucking companies who say you have to spend $100. I used to have AT&T. I was paying maybe $110 a month on internet service, just on the data package. Ridiculous, right? And then I switched to another service, and I ended up paying $50 a month. I was spending half. And so, high-speed internet, digital divide, net neutrality, these are all byproducts of inequality that comes from out of this capitalist system. And I think a lot of people want to uphold the system, not because they fully understand the impact of the system, and not because of they have a legitimate gripe with socialism, but because inequality is built into America's fabric, right? And Black people are interwoven into the fabric of American society, so you cannot separate the two. And so for them, they're saying, well, we don't want socialism, but you can't have a just system with a just outcome with an unjust input. So I think that we're seeing, moves be made on the ground level. I think what Cuomo did is a very strong move. I'd be interested in seeing how this plays out, but I still think that creating high-speed internet as a public utility is one of those ways that socialism can play a significant impact in, for Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. With the digital divide, one of the main issues that you run into is not just the schooling, but essentially the internet has been one of the great equalizers of this century for all people. You're now looking at something that, traditionally if you wanted a job, you'd go look at the wanted ads, the newspaper, go down to the place and fill out an application. Now all that can be done from your internet. Learning things on YouTube, going to school, I believe during COVID, I believe actually what ended up happening was I believe Cuomo negotiated a deal. I believe maybe like Coursera or Udemy, one of those learning platforms that essentially allowed people to, if they didn't have, if they had lost their job and they were looking to reskill, basically gave them free access to courses to tool up. So you're talking about all sorts of things like data science, coding, certifications, up to 6 months, year-long certifications that you can get. I believe there's a degree program that UPenn offers that's a computer science type of program. So you're literally talking about access to things that can improve people's livelihood, their career. We move to things like telehealth and telemedicine, having access to internet for that. So it's a very smart move. It's a very good way for people to empower themselves. And you just have to think to the roles of things like libraries, the effect that, those resources have been where, people, if they needed access to a computer, could go into a library, could go check out books, all those things, another public service. So these things are very much interwoven in our society. I think the reason with the Black community, why you hear some people, there's some hesitancy to it, is people have been sold on capitalism. That was one of the things that Nixon did. He essentially said he was going to sell Black people on Black capitalism as a means to sort of calm the rage that was going on in the 60s, early 70s, just towards the injustices that were going on. And that's where you essentially got things, what we call now opportunity zones under Trump. Those things originated with Nixon. They were essentially a way for him to sell people on the ideas of, hey, private investment coming in and it improving the community, when in all actuality, a lot of times it ended up just benefiting those big investors. And that's why you hear Republicans always go back to that trope of, opportunity zones or empowerment zones, improvement zones. They go by various names, but, that's essentially where those things have their origination, is in capitalism. So you have that's been peddled to the Black community, as well as you've had a small group of Black people who have managed to have some sort of economic success, who push this capitalistic mantra as well. But when you really go and look at it, it's like, okay, we've had some successful businesses, but what industries have we fully owned and controlled?
Right. And that's where, worker cooperatives actually make a lot of sense. Worker-owned enterprises, community-owned enterprises make a lot more sense in this aspect. But that also requires some investment. And for some of these areas, the opportunity zones did not really come into play because a lot of Black people, because of gentrification, they get, the short end of the stick. And so going back to the digital divide, and you mentioned Coursera. Yeah, Coursera was born out of all of that. That inequality. Well, why can't we find more Black tech people, in the tech industry? Well, because they haven't upskilled. Well, why didn't they upskill? Well, because the resources weren't there for them to upskill. Well, how do we create the resources for them to upskill? Well, we come up with something like Coursera or EDX, right? Which was started by MIT and Harvard, and then other institutions came along later. And so you see this movement to create resources for free and make it widely available to those who are underserved, without actually saying it's Black people who are the most underserved, right? And to your point about libraries, these are public spaces that have to be reclaimed, for one, and two, more public spaces can actually come out of the creation from a public sector standpoint, right? We have golf courses in Black communities that Black people don't even actually golf at. Mostly white people golf at these golf courses. And I find this to be very interesting. Even things like tennis, right? Black people are very, very underserved in the tennis industry, but they're not, but they have these tennis courses in their communities, but they don't have access to rackets because they can't afford them, right? I mean, these are the sort of calamities that come out of capitalism, where you need a socialist response one that works on behalf of people on the ground and helps organize the labor to make things like this work, so that you have this equality, that can create a launching pad for them to actually move up. But I don't know if capitalism is the sort of system that Black people really need because of the inequality that it produces. And so I don't know going forward if that's a logical solution that people are looking at right now.
Yeah, you also have to look at where the economy is going. We've talked about things like UBI before on the Black Brain Trust, but the economy in general is becoming more concentrated with wealth into a few people. Think about your Jeff Bezos, your Mark Zuckerbergs, your Bill Gates, those people, your Elon Musk of the world. The system in and of itself is producing these inequalities where the greater society is now starting to see the fallout from it. And you're starting to hear things like a push for universal health care or, free public education, pre-public university, things along those lines, just because of the inequalities that are essentially being produced. And the ironic thing is, like I said earlier, we've had socialistic elements within the U.S. economy already. Things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, some of the grants and subsidies that are given out to corporations, as well as I believe Tesla, for example, got like a $500 million grant from the Department of Energy, I believe. And that was one of the catalysts for the Model S being built. I believe that happened back in the early to mid 2000s, around maybe 2007, 2008. That loan was given to them, and they turned around and built the Model S with that. So these things are out there. And if you go further back, a lot of your public institutions, your land grant institutions, those were public institutions essentially that the government put in place to essentially with the goal of helping farmers basically learn the best procedures and practices for their farms, mechanize them, help lift them into the middle class. Those were things that basically were the backbone of early society for white immigrants. The Land Grant Act, where essentially people were given land to farm on. You fast forward to the 1930s and 40s, where you start to see the creation of FHA and Fannie and Freddie, and the creation of mortgages, essentially government-backed mortgages that allowed the modern middle class to be built. So it's ironic that people, to a certain extent, A, are not aware, or B, if they're aware, they hear the word socialism, they've been programmed to have such a negative reaction to it, that all of these institutions that you've seen that I just mentioned that play a major part in building the middle class in American society. People hear that and they'll then turn around and say, "Oh, well, Black people just need to lift themselves up by their bootstraps." It's insane to think about. So I think there's a perception that people have to essentially deal with versus what the actual reality is. Because when me and Mike are talking about socialism, we look at places like, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, those type of countries, and the standard of living, Singapore, the standard of living that they have in those countries is some of the highest in the world. They have some of the happiest people in the world, great access to healthcare, great education. And those economies they still have a capitalist element to them. They just have a socialist bend that sort of helps essentially root out some of the inequality that is going to be produced by the capitalist system. Versus a lot of times people hear socialism, they think places like the USSR and Venezuela, and they see the hardship that came from there, and that's the sort of triggering reaction that will come out of that.
Yeah, it's a good point, because a lot of people look at the Soviet Union and now modern day Cuba, modern day Venezuela, and say, "Oh, well, these systems don't work." Look at the Soviet Union, but they have to understand that the Soviet Union have very few trading partners to deal with, and it's kind of the reason for the precipitation for uprisings in Latin America and Africa for socialist uprisings, and so that's really the only way that was going to work. But about the land grants, no one ever complains about socialism for Europeans or white people in America, right? Elon Musk, like you mentioned, receiving half $500 million grant to start his Tesla company and get it off the ground, and SpaceX. Don't forget about SpaceX, because that also got a lot of investment from public dollars too. But see, when these public dollars are channeled in the hands of white people, then it's fine. But when it's time to channel it in the hands of black people and into communities of black and brown people, then all of a sudden, socialism is bad. And I understand where they're coming from, because they don't want equal representation under the law. They don't like that. They want to extend Jim Crow as far as it can go by maligning the ideology or the perception of socialism. And so black socialism doesn't necessarily say that you sit on your butt and don't do anything. It's more about creating systems of equity that work to the best interest of black people as a whole. If you're going to be in this country, you're going to need all the help you can get. And so the ability to reclaim spaces like libraries and public parks and things of that nature, the ability to have public housing where the government subsidizes 80% of the cost of living in these areas, and so that you can actually have the 20%, because we know from the UBI pilot program that was done in Stockton, California under former Mayor Mike Tubbs, a lot of those poor people, not just black people, a lot of those poor people there were actually spending upwards of 45+% of their income on food security. And so if people are living in from paycheck to paycheck this way, there's no way you're going to be able to accumulate wealth. You're not going to be able to generate wealth. You're not going to be able to hand anything down. You're not going to be able to retire, working from check to check like that. So you need a better system of governance in place. And I think socialism is the right response that black people don't understand. They think that, it's about the Soviet Union and what we know as Venezuela. But those are anomalies within the social fabric of socialism itself, and communism is the end goal of socialism, but it's not the ultimate goal. And I don't think that people really understand these nuances at all.
Yeah, and I think also when you look even internationally to African countries, they have not looked to capitalism as their savior. When you look at a Julius Nyerere, a Thomas Sankara, a Kwame Nkrumah, even a Muammar Gaddafi, those were all socialist leaders who basically, that was when they came to power, that was where they tried to turn the economy in that direction. I know you mentioned in the introduction, Mike, when you were talking about the logo on the channel, that was Thomas Sankara and, his belief in medicine and focusing on things like literacy rates and, raising the standards of living for the people. Essentially, that's what those leaders have focused on in trying to move their countries forward. Same thing with Libya. Libya had one of the higher living standards in all of Africa prior to Gaddafi being removed from power. Things like education, I believe housing, lots of things were heavily subsidized, if not outright free, for people in those countries, and thus the living standard improved. So, like I said, when you look at the ideas of who's embraced socialism and the results it's produced early, but unfortunately due to geopolitical pressures and essentially proxy wars, a lot of these leaders had their countries destabilized before they were really allowed to really make the progress necessary. People don't necessarily have that outstanding shining example of it, and they're still in the sense lured by the idea of capitalism with here in the United States. When you look at a lot of, some of our bigger success stories, like, I mainly go to people in the music and entertainment industry and think about, like a Jay-Z or a Kanye West or P. Diddy or Oprah. Or even if you look at someone like a Robert Smith or David Stewart, people tend to want to gravitate to those success stories. And that can be a hindrance as well, too, in the sense of not understanding that those are major outliers. And it's, for every one of those people that you produce, you're going to produce, 100,000 people who are struggling, can't make ends meet, have poor living standards, poor living conditions, poor health, poor access to opportunities. So I think that's sort of the illusion that people struggle with at times.
Yeah, the reflection of the people, the condition of the people is a reflection of the policies that are in place. And so Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman, stated this about a month or so ago that, poverty is an issue of policy. And there was some pushback. It was like, oh, what are you talking about? Nobody's born rich. But the reality is the policies that were designed to keep a specific demographic of people subservient and put into what we now know as an underclass. And so, yeah, policy matters. It's not about whether or not you're born with wealth, but you're born into a situation that actually helps. From speaking from a white person's perspective, you're more likely to get access to a loan. We know that during COVID and prior to COVID in the housing crisis of the late 2000s, white people who worked at Home Depot with a lower credit score were more likely to get access to a lower percentage loan than a black person who made substantially more in a higher credit score. We saw that during COVID. A black man who had a credit score of 750 went into Wells Fargo to get a PPP loan, and he was denied a business loan, and he was denied. So when you say that, if people just work harder, if they pull themselves by their bootstraps, these sort of ideals are rooted in the racism and the inequality that capitalism has produced, and has a lot of people duped into the idea that if you just worked a little harder, that you would get further. And that's not the case. We know that's not the case now, based on the statistics, based on the analysis, based on the UBI pilot tests that have gone out. An extra $500 a month goes a long way for poor black people. We know that the nickel and diming, people who go to jail, on these cash bail systems. I think Chicago or Illinois might have been the first state to get rid of that. These sort of predatory systems are actually the ones that hurt black people from a capitalist standpoint. So why do we need a system that doesn't initially work? People look at the materialistic output and say, I'm able to buy this car and I'm able to live in this house. And it's like, yeah, for a short time, up until there's a bubble, and then you're right back to square one. And so this sort of system has these sort of periodic hiccups, like in 2000, you had the dot-com bubble, and then in 2008, you had Lehman Brothers in the financial bubble then, and then you had another hiccup slightly, during the pandemic. You had a major hiccup. A lot of retail going out of business, a lot of places, a lot of real estate being turned upside down, malls going out of business, just sitting around doing nothing. These sort of spaces can be reclaimed, under land trusts. And then a land bank can help subsidize the acquisition of these sort of social spaces that black people can greatly benefit from, and actually turn them into more social, human-centered environments that actually help benefit black people, from a worker cooperative, worker owned enterprise, black owned schools. I just saw that there's some new HBCUs that are being launched, which kind of goes against the idea of traditional schooling that you see that have been badly managed, in a lot of cities, now a lot of people who graduate from HBCUs are bringing their knowledge from HBCUs and actually trying to build their own schools in their own social spaces in these environments. And so this is the sort of mindset that goes into creating a Black socialist society and a way to liberate yourself.
Yeah. One institution that comes to mind is I believe it's Mondragon Corporation, based in. Oh, go ahead. It's based in Spain. I believe it's the Biscay region of Spain. Essentially, this is a major cooperative. Essentially, what happens is you have this corporation who has business and finance, retail. I believe also in the not the auto industry, the retail space as well. Essentially, it's a corporation that functions with rules for the employees versus the management to ensure that some of these inequalities don't exist, or not to the extreme levels, and it's very much an anchor institution in that area, in the region of the country. It has its own, I believe it has its own public university as well as grade schools as well. And you have rules in place that ensure that, for example, a CEO can't make more than, say, 10 times the lowest paid worker. Or, for example, when COVID hit, instead of laying people off, they voted to reduce everyone's salary for X amount of time. Or, for example, instead of laying off people, they shifted them to a different business area of the company. This is an example of a major corporation that has sort of that cooperative socialist model that could be replicated and be useful to the Black community, as far as when you look at community development, joint cooperatives. That's just one example in the world of different models that are available that we can use. We've used things like cooperatives in places like Northeast before. And like I said earlier on the podcast, mentioning things like mutual aid society. So part of it is just things that are there and we've just gotten away from. And then part of it is things that we can take to a higher scale that could really help us get ahead in America.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that we have antitrust laws for that reason, to prevent, capitalist enterprises from underrepresenting and not protecting the employees in relation to the employer, as well as work cooperatives like you mentioned in Mondragon out in Spain. And so they have up to 100,000 members, not employees, but members of their worker cooperative. And they pay their dues and things of that nature. And so this model can scale in from a fourth industrial perspective by creating, micro mobility, micro transportation, putting together, lines of code. Instead of relying on automation, you can actually hire thousands of Black people who can learn how to code and actually write code so we can build our own tech, tech startups that actually can gross, $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion valuations that can rival Silicon Valley easily. There's no excuse as to why something like this can't work. You can actually make this work at scale. And so how I envision this is that you can have unlimited vacation as long as you get your work done. You can have, members of this cooperatives, work different roles. If you decide that you want to go on sabbatical for 6 weeks or something like that, by all means, knock yourself out. But just understand that as long as you get your work done, you can actually leave. Right? You can take that vacation. Or if you do want to take that vacation, go ahead and go do that. There'll be somebody else there to fulfill and backfill in your absence, and so you don't have all of these sort of contentious relations between HR, the co-workers, and so on and so forth. There's an understanding at the table, and this is all democratically run. And a lot of people Black people don't have democracy in the workplace for that very reason, that capitalist enterprises don't allow that. We see many Black people who go to HR, they're dissatisfied with their, with the work environment itself, and they're kind of at a crossroads, and they're powerless within their organization, and they have to actually keep working and to produce because they don't really have an alternative, or at least they think they don't have an alternative. But if we create the alternative by having these worker co-ops and worker-owned enterprises that actually can compete in certain areas and really focus on social impact initiatives, I think there's a window of opportunity to actually engage and take this further. But that's the idea of Black socialism. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think it's just a matter of like I said, of people looking back historically and seeing what we've done and looking at the tools we need going forward. Because I think overall, even if you take it outside of the Black community for a second, like you said, with Fourth Industrial Revolution, this is going to come to a head for all of America. Just so many people are going to be, I wouldn't say rendered useless, but essentially their skill set is going to be obsolete. When you start looking at robots and automation, artificial intelligence, all of these things coming in and replacing jobs, people are going to have to move to something like we've discussed, like a UBI or something along like those lines, or you're going to have to restructure it because essentially you're going to have even more so than what you have now with the oligarchs that you have now. You're going to have even larger ones because you're going to essentially have these people who have large sums of capital, and they're going to have, robots and machines doing all the work for them. And essentially you're not going to be employing as many people. So you're just going to have this higher and higher amount of profitability. But at a certain point, you've got to look at, okay, who am I going to sell this stuff to? What are going to be the implications on things like democracy and equality in society? So it's going to come to a head in the greater society, and maybe that's what it'll be, the catalyst for people in the Black community to start thinking along those lines as well, instead of people feeling like, hey, the society's moving in one direction and I'm moving in another.
Yeah, to be my last statement, but a lot of Black people talk about group economics and don't realize that group economics is a construct of socialism in itself. There's various forms of socialism, but group economics is actually the core layer of it. And I think if Black people really want to practice group economics, they have to understand socialism as a whole. And so, last statements, Renaissance.
Yeah, no, I think that about covers it. Like I said, I think people just have to be aware of the downfalls of the current system, come to the realization that the system, the way it's currently structured, disproportionately affects Black people, and really no amount of up by your bootstraps or individual effort is going to be able to allow the collective to overcome. You're going to have to look at different strategies and utilizing every resource and creative thinking, as well as what you've done historically to advance and move forward in, the new America, post Fourth Industrial Revolution America, because just the old models and the things that we have been sold on have not closed the gap. The wealth gap has only gotten larger or remained stagnant. And like I said, historically, when you look at what built the middle class for the greater society, it was not an up by your bootstraps philosophy. It was a lot of government intervention, a lot of government subsidies. So
definitely, thank you all for joining us, man. Please hit the like button if you have not already done so, and share the video if possible. Also follow us on Twitter at brother_podcast. We're definitely on Twitter, so Make sure you check us out there. Renaissance, thanks for coming on and helping out with this. And if you have any feedback, please leave it in the comment section.